More than 2,600 years ago, in the heart of the ancient Near East, a king ruled with an iron fist and an obsession with absolute domination. His name? Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, whose reign, 668, around 631 BCE, marked one of the most brutal and fascinating periods in human history. But behind his legendary library, considered the first in the world, and his monumental architectural achievements, lay a ruler who used terror as a tool of control. Among the many atrocities he committed, one stands out for its chilling symbolism. He ordered the tongues of all his defeated enemies to be cut out. Why mutilate the tongue? Because he didn't just want to destroy bodies, he wanted to eliminate the ability to speak, to tell stories, to pass down memory. It was a way to annihilate the very identity of his rivals, ensuring they could never again claim power or dignity. This practice, though extreme, was part of a deliberate strategy to sow fear among both his subjects and adversaries. If you knew that facing Ashurbanipal meant losing your tongue, or worse, you would think twice before rebelling. The king didn't act out of sheer madness, but rather as part of a political and religious system where absolute power was upheld by constant displays of strength. The Assyrians were infamous for their brutality, but under Ashurbanipal, this policy reached almost theatrical levels. Scenes of executions, torture, and mutilation are engraved in stone reliefs, graphic testimonies that still shock us today with their rawness. In these images, we see prisoners being beheaded, flayed alive, or dragged by horses while their tongues and hands have been amputated. Ashurbanipal was not just a warrior, but also a clever strategist. He understood that violence had to be visible and unforgettable. His military campaigns were designed not only to conquer territories, but to send a clear message. Resistance would be punished in inhuman ways. And this message wasn't limited to his direct enemies. It was also directed at his own people, as a tacit warning of what would happen to anyone who dared question his authority. But what kind of man ordered such horrors? Ashurbanipal was trained from a young age to rule. He learned to read and write in Sumerian and Akkadian, languages he mastered, something rare even among kings of his time. Moreover, he was an avid collector of knowledge. The famous Library of Nineveh, discovered in the 19th century and composed of thousands of cuneiform tablets, was created by him. It held medical, astronomical, literary, and magical texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works in world literature. This duality is fascinating. A cultured man, interested in knowledge, capable of writing poems and maintaining refined correspondence with his generals, and at the same time responsible for some of the most extreme forms of institutionalized violence ever recorded. It is no coincidence that his figure has been compared to other dictators throughout history, those who used culture and terror as two sides of the same coin. The question then arises, how did such a man come to wield so much power? The answer lies in the structure of the Assyrian Empire, which was based on centralized administration and an unprecedented network of espionage and propaganda. Ashurbanipal had informants everywhere, and any rumor of treason was swiftly and exemplarily crushed. Moreover, he presented himself to his people as the chosen of the gods, especially Ashur, the chief deity of the Assyrian pantheon. Under this divine image, his acts, no matter how brutal, were justified as necessary to maintain cosmic order. But even the most powerful empires have a limit. Ashurbanipal's legacy was as grand as it was fleeting. After his death, the Assyrian Empire began to crumble. Within just a few years, Nineveh, his glorious capital, was sacked and destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. His fall was so complete that to this day, his tomb has never been found, nor any definitive physical trace of his body. a cruel and ironic end for a man who dedicated his life to erasing the memory of his enemies. And yet, though his body has vanished, his voice still echoes through the clay tablets that survived fire and time. Those same tablets that recount his victories and his cruel punishments. Among them, a phrase frequently appears in his inscriptions: "Let anyone who reads these words tremble with fear." That was his true ambition, not just to conquer lands, but to instill a fear so deep that it would endure for centuries. And in a way, he succeeded. Today, thousands of years later, we're still talking about him, wondering how one man could embody such wisdom and such cruelty in a single existence. Ashurbanipal was not born destined for the throne. He was the second son of King Esarhaddon, and initially his older brother, Shamash Shumuukin, was designated as the heir to the vast Assyrian Empire. However, internal politics, palace intrigue, and the power struggles among noble factions led to Ashurbanipal being trained from a young age to assume a position that, in theory, would never have rightfully been his. But nothing was ever final in the Assyrian court, where loyalty was as fickle as the desert wind. His father, aware of the tense political climate and the constant rebellions within the empire, decided to secure the dynastic future by appointing Ashurbanipal as ruler of Egypt, even though, in practice, he never firmly controlled that territory. What truly mattered wasn't the title, but the preparation. From a young age, Ashurbanipal was subjected to a rigorous education, designed to mold him not only as a military leader, but also as a relentless administrator and a living symbol of divine will. The Assyrians firmly believed that the order of the universe depended on the king. He was the intermediary between the gods and men, charged with maintaining peace through exemplary punishment. And in this context, cruelty was not seen as evil, but as divine justice applied without mercy. Extreme violence had a religious and political purpose, to remind everyone that defying the king was the same as defying the cosmos itself. Ashurbanipal was educated by the finest teachers of his time. He learned history, mathematics, religious rituals, and military strategy. But he was also trained in the art of propaganda, how to build an unbreakable public image. In his personal letters, many of which are preserved on the tablets of Nineveh, a deeply paranoid man is revealed, obsessed with betrayal and surrounded by advisors competing for his favor, while accusing each other of conspiracies. Every major decision had to pass through the filter of diviners. If an omen was negative, Ashurbanipal could cancel entire military campaigns. But when the gods gave their approval, he acted with brutal determination. Even in his youth, he showed personality traits that would define his reign: perfectionism, paranoia, a need for absolute control, and an insatiable thirst for recognition. These elements combined to create a ruler who didn't just want to be obeyed. He wanted to be feared. Winning battles wasn't enough. He had to leave an indelible legacy, carved in stone and flesh. When he finally ascended to the throne around 668 BC, following the premature death of his father in battle, Ashurbanipal wasted no time. He inherited an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran, but it was riddled with weak points, rebellious satrapies, fragile alliances, and enemies waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew he couldn't afford to show weakness. His message had to be clear from day one. I am the master, and my word is law. And so his reign began, with fire, blood, and terror. His first campaigns were against the rebels in southern Mesopotamia, including his own brother, Shamash Shumuukin, who had proclaimed himself king of Babylon and refused to accept Ashurbanipal's authority. This fratricidal war lasted years and ended with the total destruction of Babylon, including its sacred temples and libraries. Surrounded and cornered, the brother chose to throw himself into the flames rather than surrender. a dignified act that contrasts dramatically with Ashurbanipal's lack of compassion. This episode marked a turning point. If one of his own family members dared defy him, what message would he send if he let it go unpunished? He decided there would be no limits. Neither blood nor religion would protect those who opposed his will. The consequences of disobedience would be visible, brutal, and absolute. It was then that he institutionalized a series of terror practices that today seem unimaginable. Among them, the infamous cutting out of tongues. This punishment was not random. The tongue symbolized the ability to speak, to lie, to conspire, to claim power. By removing it, Ashurbanipal didn't just physically silence the enemy. He turned them into a walking reminder of what happened to those who dared defy him. Often, these mutilated prisoners were displayed publicly in the squares of Nineveh, alongside other war trophies, heads impaled on stakes, hands piled as offerings to the gods, and inscriptions detailing the atrocities committed. What's shocking is that all of this was not only done, but proudly recorded. The scenes were carved in relief on the walls of the royal palace, where thousands could see them. It was a form of advertising royal power, a visual message that said, "Look what I do to my enemies. Who's next?" Moreover, these images were accompanied by written texts in Akkadian, where Ashurbanipal described his victories and punishments in detail. He used grandiloquent, almost epic language, comparing himself to lions, eagles, and other dominant creatures of nature. He presented himself as invincible, blessed by the gods, and endowed with superior intelligence. In one of his most famous inscriptions, he wrote, "I, Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, whom the great gods chose with love and granted an eternal reign." These declarations weren't mere boastful claims. They were part of a strategy for constructing power. The greater the narrative, the harder it became to challenge. And in a world where information traveled slowly and media were limited, control of the official discourse was key. But behind this facade of omnipotence, Ashurbanipal was tormented by visions of chaos and defeat. In his private letters to priests and astrologers, he constantly expressed concern about betrayals, illnesses, and bad omens. He even ordered mass exorcisms in the palace, symbolic human sacrifices, and nighttime rituals to ward off evil spirits. He firmly believed that the balance of the world depended on him, and that any mistake on his part could unleash the apocalypse. This paranoia, paradoxically, reinforced his tendency toward violence. If every day without discovering a betrayal was a victory, then constant vigilance and the use of terror were indispensable tools. He couldn't afford to trust anyone, because anyone could be the next traitor. As his reign progressed, Ashurbanipal consolidated a system of government based on fear, censorship, and the systematic elimination of rivals. His generals and governors knew that failure meant death, or worse, public humiliation followed by prolonged torture. This ensured blind obedience, but also planted deep resentment that, over time, contributed to the collapse of the empire. Yet during his lifetime, Ashurbanipal managed to keep an immense territory under control. With millions of inhabitants of different cultures, religions, and languages, all under one mandate, unified by fear and the glory of a single man. But as with all stories of extreme power, the question remains the same. How long can an empire built on terror truly last? The Library of Nineveh, the bright side of a dark king. At first glance, it seems contradictory that a man whose reign was marked by violence and terror was also the creator of the first library in the known world, a collection of more than 30,000 clay tablets containing all the knowledge of his time. But this duality is precisely what makes Ashurbanipal so fascinating. He was a cruel monarch, yes, but also one of the greatest patrons of knowledge in antiquity. Located in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, The library of Ashurbanipal was not merely a storage of texts, but an institution designed to concentrate, preserve, and manage the knowledge of his vast empire. Its tablets covered everything from medical treatises, astronomical manuals, and pharmaceutical recipes to epic literature, mythology, and religious rituals. Some even contain examples of what we would now call primitive psychology, with diagnoses of mental disorders attributed to demonic possessions or astrological influences. The fact that Ashurbanipal gathered this cultural treasure in one place tells us a great deal about him. He was a man obsessed with control, not just political or military control, but intellectual as well. If he could dominate information, he could dominate reality itself. It wasn't just about accumulating wisdom. It was about deciding what knowledge should survive and what should not. But how did he come to create something like this? Although his education was strictly royal, it included an academic training that was rare for a king of his time. From a young age, he learned to read and write in Sumerian and Akkadian, languages primarily used by scribes and priests. In one of his most famous inscriptions, Ashurbanipal boasted, "By the grace of Nabu, the god of wisdom, I have received the gift of writing. I can read the complex tablets of Sumer and Akkad, even those that are difficult to understand." This level of scholarship allowed him to surround himself with a court of specialists, translators, and copyists who worked day and night to transcribe, organize, and catalog thousands of documents from across Mesopotamia. Many of these tablets were obtained through the plundering of enemy cities such as Babylon and Elam, where entire libraries were confiscated and taken to Nineveh. Thus, the knowledge of the enemy was not only absorbed, but turned into Assyrian heritage. But this was not a selfless act of love for culture. Like everything he did, Ashurbanipal had a strategic purpose behind the creation of his library. The tablets served to help him make political, military, and religious decisions. Omens, astrological forecasts, and magical texts were tools of governance. He himself consulted these documents before launching campaigns or making changes in the court. Moreover, having access to so many texts gave him a diplomatic advantage. Knowing how his rivals thought, what gods they worshipped, what legends they believed in, and how they resolved legal conflicts allowed him to better manipulate international relations. The library didn't just store knowledge, it weaponized it. One of the most valuable treasures of the library is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest epic poem in the world. This text includes a Mesopotamian version of the Great Flood, very similar to the biblical story of Noah, and explores the search for immortality. It is notable that Ashurbanipal owned several copies of this text, suggesting he had a personal interest in profound themes such as death, destiny, and the meaning of power. Tablets dedicated to medicine were also found, describing diseases such as epilepsy, depression, and chronic pain, along with remedies based on plants, minerals, and incantations. Other texts dealt with astronomy, containing eclipse predictions and detailed observations of planetary movements. These records demonstrate that the Assyrians had advanced knowledge of the cosmos, even if they interpreted it within a religious framework. But perhaps the most surprising finding in the library is what we would now call intelligence manuals or espionage guides. Some tablets contain instructions on how to recruit informants, detect betrayal, and sow discord among enemies. This confirms that Ashurbanipal not only surveilled his people, but developed a sophisticated intelligence network that operated across the empire and beyond. All this raises an intriguing question. Was Ashurbanipal a true lover of knowledge, or did he simply use it as a means to maintain absolute power? The answer is likely both. He was a cultured man, yes, but also deeply pragmatic. His library was not an altruistic gift to humanity. It was a tool of power, just like his armies or his brutal punishments. Yet paradoxically, because of that controlling obsession, Much of Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian knowledge has reached us today. When Nineveh was destroyed around 612 BCE during the fall of the Assyrian Empire, the library was buried under the rubble. For centuries, it remained hidden, protected by the very ruins that sealed its fate. It was accidentally discovered in the 19th century by British archaeologists excavating what is now Iraq. And although many tablets were found damaged, enough survived for us to read words written more than 2,500 years ago. Among them, we hear the voice of Ashurbanipal, who wrote, "I have gathered in my palace tablets of every kind, for instruction and teaching. I have cared for them. I have given orders for them to be copied and preserved." These words, inscribed in clay, are proof that even in the darkness of absolute power, a ray of light can emerge. Ashurbanipal didn't just build an empire based on fear. He also built an intellectual legacy that continues to inspire us. His library didn't just store stories, it preserved human memory. And so, while the bodies of his enemies have vanished and his wars have become historical anecdotes, his tablets still speak, telling the world who was that king who ordered tongues to be cut out and also ordered words to be saved. Ashurbanipal's tortures. How terror became official policy. If there is one thing that defines Ashurbanipal as a ruler, beyond his intelligence or obsession with knowledge, it is his systematic use of terror as a tool of political control. Under his reign, violence ceased to be an occasional resource and became institutionalized practice, a fundamental part of his strategy to maintain a vast, diverse empire, constantly threatened by internal rebellions. Torture was not merely a form of punishment. It was a message, a spectacle designed to impress, humiliate, and psychologically paralyze any potential enemy. In the walls of his palaces, in clay tablets, and in the reports of his generals, it is clear that Ashurbanipal not only tolerated these acts, he personally ordered them. One of the most chilling practices he carried out was the ritual mutilation of prisoners of war and political traitors. Among the most common forms of punishment were tearing out tongues. As previously mentioned, one of the most powerful symbols of total control over an enemy was depriving them of the ability to speak. By cutting out a man's tongue, Ashurbanipal ensured that he could never reclaim honor, authority, or even defend himself. It was a way to annihilate him both symbolically and physically. Gouging out eyes. Blindness was seen as an extreme form of dehumanization. Without vision, the prisoner was incapacitated both physically and metaphorically. He could no longer see his fate or the world he had betrayed. Many of these men were then forced to work on public projects or serve in menial labor under the relentless Mesopotamian sun, flaying alive. This was one of the most brutal forms of execution. The entire skin of the condemned person was removed while they were still alive, and then that skin was displayed as a trophy. Scenes of this type appear carved in the reliefs of the Palace of Nineveh, showing bodies hung on poles or stretched across ceremonial structures. Impaling traitors. Similar to what other bloodthirsty rulers like Vlad the Impaler would do centuries later, Ashurbanipal used this technique as a visual warning. The impaled corpses were placed at the entrances of conquered cities, serving as grim reminders of what awaited those who dared rebel. Public beheadings. Mass executions were planned to coincide with religious festivals or military victories. This turned the king into the absolute protagonist of a bloody drama where he displayed his divine power. These methods were not improvisations by brutal soldiers on the battlefield. They were part of a protocol established by the monarch himself. In fact, official documents exist in which Ashurbanipal gives detailed instructions on how prisoners should be treated. In one letter addressed to one of his generals, he wrote, "To the leaders of the rebellion, cut out their tongues and gouge out their eyes. As for the rest, kill them with sharp swords and impale their heads on stakes. This level of detail suggests that he didn't merely want his enemies to die. He wanted them to die in a specific way, designed to maximize psychological impact on both witnesses and those who would later hear about it. Ashurbanipal also practiced collective punishment. If an entire city rose up against him, he didn't just punish the leaders. Whole families were deported, enslaved, or simply exterminated. Children, the elderly, and innocent women were victims of reprisals aimed at sending a clear message. There would be no mercy for those who broke loyalty to the king. A particularly brutal example occurred during the campaign against Elam, Assyria's ancient rival located in what is now Iran. After a series of prolonged conflicts, Ashurbanipal decided to invade and completely destroy Elam. His troops looted temples, burned cities, and killed indiscriminately. In a triumphant inscription, the king described his revenge. "I cut off the heads of their kings and hung them in my tents. The survivors I flayed alive and used their skins to cover the walls of my city." This quote not only reveals his sadism, but also his skill at using horror as propaganda. He didn't just want to win the war. He wanted the whole world to know exactly what he did to Elam. His message was clear: if you defy me, your civilization will be wiped off the map. Another memorable episode was his war against his brother Shamash-Shumuukin, who proclaimed himself king of Babylon and broke the family alliance. For years, Ashurbanipal besieged him without mercy. When he finally took the city, there was no quarter. Temples were destroyed, libraries burned, and thousands of people executed or enslaved. Surrounded and without escape, his brother chose to throw himself into the flames rather than surrender. But that wasn't enough for Ashurbanipal. He ordered salt to be scattered over Babylon's foundations as a symbol that it should never again rise as a threat. Why such cruelty? Because in Ashurbanipal's mind, fear was the only universal language. In a multicultural empire where each region had its own language, gods, and traditions, the one thing everyone understood was terror. It was a direct, unambiguous form of communication. "I am the master, and if you disobey me, this is your fate." Moreover, these practices had a religious background. The Assyrians believed the king was the earthly representative of the gods, especially of Ashur, their principal deity. And as such, he was to apply divine justice, even if cruel. For them, pain was a form of purification. Killing a traitor wasn't just punishment, it was cleansing the cosmic order that had been disturbed. But behind this apparent religious logic was also a very human motivation: Ashurbanipal's constant fear. In private letters discovered in the library of Nineveh, the king expressed his paranoia about possible betrayals, diseases, and bad omens. He wrote to his priests asking for exorcisms, protective rituals, and animal entrail readings to predict the future. He lived obsessed with the idea that someone within his court would betray him. And so, the more he feared, the more violent he became. It was a cycle that consumed him. The more enemies he imagined, the more he felt the need to eliminate them. And in doing so, he created new enemies, which in turn fed his paranoia. But perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is that it worked. Under Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He ruled for decades without major internal revolts. He managed to keep disparate regions united under a single will. And although his legacy was destroyed shortly after his death during his lifetime, no one dared openly challenge him. Today, when we see the reliefs of Nineveh, when we read the tablets that survived time, we understand that we are facing a man who not only ordered tongues to be cut out, he ordered the very history of his enemies to be erased. Ashurbanipal's enemies, those who dared challenge the king of terror. Throughout his reign, Ashurbanipal faced a series of rivals who, despite the fear he inspired, dared to defy his authority. Among them were Shamash-shuma-ukin, his own brother, king of Babylon, who broke the family alliance and became the target of a brutal war that ended with his suicide and the destruction of Babylon. The kingdom of Elam, an ancient enemy of Assyria, whose cities were plundered and whose people were annihilated as punishment for supporting rebellions against the Assyrian king. The Egyptian rebels, where Necho was captured and executed following a military campaign to reassert Assyrian control over the Nile Delta. Each of these enemies suffered exemplary punishments: mutilations, public executions, mass deportations. None escaped the wrath of Ashurbanipal, who claimed that no one raises a hand against me and lives to tell about it. The fall of the Assyrian Empire, Ashurbanipal's fault or inevitable fate. Although Ashurbanipal was the last great king of Assyria, his legacy was buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh. Just a few years after his death, around 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians launched a final assault on the Assyrian capital. The city was looted, burned, and completely destroyed. Some historians blame Ashurbanipal for exhausting the army with constant campaigns and for sowing so much fear that it created internal resentments that could no longer be contained. Others believe the fall was inevitable. An empire built on terror cannot stand forever. Without a leader as powerful as he was, the provinces rebelled, alliances collapsed, and Assyria disappeared from the map forever. Today, only the tablets, the bloody reliefs, and the name of a king who had everything and lost everything remain. Ashurbanipal's legacy, between fear and knowledge. Ashurbanipal is remembered as a historical paradox, a cruel king who spread terror, but also a protector of knowledge who created the world's first library. His acts of extreme violence still shock those who read his reliefs or study his letters, yet his intellectual legacy endures. Thanks to him, we know the Epic of Gilgamesh, ancient medical texts, astronomical tablets, and a unique vision of the ancient world. His library was a beacon of knowledge in an era dominated by war. But he also left behind a dark message: absolute power, sustained by fear, cannot last forever. His empire collapsed, his city was erased, and his name nearly vanished from human memory. Although his body was never found, his words were. And they still speak from the clay tablets, telling the story of a man who ordered tongues to be cut out, but also commanded that stories be preserved. That is his true legacy, the balance between barbarism and wisdom.